My husband Marcus thought he was brilliant, planning my own death to look like a PTSD-related suicide so he could collect my $2.5 million military life insurance and start fresh with his fitness instructor. But what he didn't know was that my Marine Corps training had taught me to recognize threats from any direction, and his perfect murder plot was about to become his final mission. When the VA psychiatrist he'd been bribing called to warn me about the falsified mental health records, Marcus discovered that his supposedly broken veteran wife had been 3 steps ahead all along, and the trap he'd set for me was about to close around him instead. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the story of how I turned my husband's assassination plan into his own destruction is one that unfolded over 8 months of careful surveillance, strategic deception, and the kind of tactical precision they don't teach in marriage counseling. Before I dive deeper, drop a comment below and let me know what country you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button because I've got more shocking revelations coming your way tomorrow. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, and until 8 months ago, I believed I was living the American dream that I'd fought overseas to protect. Picture this. A renovated farmhouse in Fayetteville, North Carolina, just outside Fort Bragg, with wraparound porches and oak trees that had witnessed generations of military families building their lives after service. 2 cars in the gravel, driveway, my restored 1967 Mustang that I'd rebuilt during my recovery from my last deployment, and Marcus's gleaming black Silverado truck that he claimed represented his success as a civilian contractor. We had Ranger, a German Shepherd mix I'd adopted from a military working dog program after he'd been retired, due to a training injury that left him with a slight limp, but an unshakable loyalty that would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. Every evening, Ranger would position himself between Marcus and me during dinner, a behavior I'd attributed to protective instincts rather than the warning sign it actually was. Marcus Thompson was everything I thought I wanted in a partner when we met at a Veterans of Foreign Wars fundraiser in Raleigh 3 years ago. He was tall, confident, with the kind of easy smile that made you forget your own name and the smooth charm that came from years of selling himself to potential clients. He worked in defense contracting, always talking about his next big project, always dressed in expensive polo shirts that made him look like he'd stepped out of a country club, rather than the blue-collar background he claimed to come from. Was working as a military transition counselor back then, helping veterans navigate the complex process of returning to civilian life after combat deployments. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decently and gave me a sense of purpose after my own difficult transition following 3 tours in Afghanistan. Marcus swept me off my feet with weekend trips to Asheville, dinners at restaurants where I couldn't pronounce half the items on the menu, and a proposal on the beach at Wilmington that felt like something out of a romantic movie. When he slipped that 2-carat diamond ring on my finger, I genuinely believed I was the luckiest woman alive. Here was a successful civilian who understood the military culture, who seemed proud of my service rather than intimidated by it, and who promised to help me build the stable home life I'd dreamed about during those long nights in forward operating bases across Kandahar province. Our wedding was everything I'd imagined during those deployments when I'd lie awake listening to incoming mortar rounds and dreaming about normal life. A ceremony at the Old Well at the University of North Carolina, where Marcus had supposedly earned his business degree, followed by a reception at a historic inn in Chapel Hill that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Marcus insisted on paying for everything himself, claiming his contracting business was doing so well that money was no object. "Nothing's too good for my warrior princess," he'd say, and I believed every word that came out of his mouth. I believed his stories about classified defense contracts that he couldn't discuss in detail. I believed his explanations for why I'd never met any of his supposed college friends or business partners. I believed him when he said his family had disowned him for marrying a damaged veteran, and that's why they never visited or called. For the first year of our marriage, life together was exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. Marcus's business seemed to be thriving, allowing us to buy the farmhouse and renovate it exactly the way I'd always pictured my dream home. We installed a workshop in the barn where I could work on classic cars, a hobby that helped manage the anxiety and sleeplessness that still lingered from my combat experiences. We planted a vegetable garden that reminded me of my grandmother's farm in rural Virginia, where I'd spent summers as a child learning about hard work and self-reliance. Marcus seemed genuinely supportive of my recovery process. He attended my VA appointments when I asked him to, listened patiently when nightmares would wake me up in cold sweats, and never complained when I needed space to process difficult memories or emotions. He encouraged me to stay connected with my military friends, hosting barbecues for my old unit whenever they were in town, and even learned military terminology so he could better understand my experiences. But here's the thing about perfect lives that I learned the hard way in Afghanistan. When something seems too good to be true, it usually is, and the most dangerous threats often come from the people you trust most completely. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared about 18 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as a warning sign at the time. Marcus started becoming more secretive about his work, claiming new security clearances that prevented him from discussing his projects even in general terms. He began traveling more frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time, to locations he couldn't specify for what he called sensitive government contracts. I told myself this was normal. Defense contracting is a complex industry with legitimate security requirements. Successful contractors often work on classified projects that require discretion and extensive travel. As a veteran who'd held security clearances myself, I understood the importance of operational security and the need to compartmentalize sensitive information. What I didn't know then was that Marcus's business hadn't just been struggling. It had never actually existed in any meaningful way. What I didn't know was that the expensive lifestyle we were living was being funded through credit fraud, identity theft, and an increasingly complex web of financial deception that he'd been building since before we met. What I didn't know was that while I was playing the supportive military wife, Marcus was planning an exit strategy that would leave me dead and him living comfortably in a non-extradition country with a new identity and my life insurance money. The irony is that if Marcus had just been honest with me about his financial problems, I would have helped him. I would have downsized our lifestyle, sold the house, done whatever it took to support the man I loved through a difficult period. My military training had taught me that you never leave a fellow soldier behind, and I applied that same loyalty to my marriage. But Marcus didn't want a partner in solving his problems. He wanted a victim whose death would solve them for him. And that's exactly what he thought I was going to be, right up until the moment he discovered that his supposedly traumatized, vulnerable veteran wife had inherited more than just PTSD from her military service. There's something about me that Marcus never fully understood, something that would ultimately become his fatal miscalculation. I wasn't just the damaged combat veteran he'd married. I was also a Marine Corps intelligence specialist who'd spent 3 years identifying and neutralizing threats in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. You don't survive multiple combat deployments without developing an almost supernatural ability to detect when something doesn't feel right. And you definitely don't make it home alive without learning how to gather intelligence, analyze threats, and respond with decisive action. My military training might not have been in my daily thoughts during our peaceful civilian life, but those skills were still there, lying dormant like muscle memory waiting for the right trigger to activate them. When Marcus's behavior started changing, when the inconsistencies in his stories began accumulating, I didn't just ignore my instincts the way a typical civilian spouse might. I started conducting what we called pattern analysis in the military, carefully documenting every detail that didn't add up. I didn't know I was building a case that would save my life. I thought I was just being a concerned wife trying to understand why her husband was becoming increasingly distant and secretive. But as it turned out, those months of careful observation and documentation would become the foundation of Marcus's downfall. Because while he was busy planning what he thought would be the perfect murder, I was unknowingly building the perfect defense. The man who thought he could outsmart a trained military intelligence officer had forgotten the most basic rule of warfare: never underestimate your enemy, especially when your enemy has been trained by the United States Marine Corps to identify and eliminate threats to American interests. Marcus was about to learn that his biggest threat wasn't some foreign adversary or business competitor. It was the woman sleeping next to him every night, the woman whose training and experience made her far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. To understand how completely Marcus fooled me, you need to understand what our life looked like from the inside during those blissful early years when I believed every word he said and trusted him with my entire future. Every morning started with the same comforting routine that made civilian life feel stable after years of unpredictable military schedules. Marcus's alarm would sound at 6:30, followed by his methodical morning ritual of checking his phone, showering with military precision, and selecting one of his crisp polo shirts from our walk-in closet. I'd brew coffee in our spacious farmhouse kitchen while he reviewed what he called his project portfolios, documents spread across our granite countertop that always seemed critically important, but that he never allowed me to examine too closely. The papers were covered in official-looking letterhead from various defense contractors, filled with technical specifications and budget projections that looked legitimate to my untrained civilian eye. "Big presentation today, sweetheart," he'd say, kissing my forehead before grabbing his leather messenger bag and heading toward his truck. "The Pentagon contract is finally moving to the next phase. If this approval comes through, we're looking at a 7-figure deal that could set us up for early retirement." I'd smile and wish him success, genuinely proud that my husband was so accomplished in the complex world of government contracting. The Riverside Defense Initiative had been Marcus's primary focus for about 8 months, a supposed missile guidance system upgrade that he claimed would revolutionize military targeting capabilities. He'd show me artist renderings of the technology, explain the strategic advantages it would provide to American forces overseas, and discuss the challenges of working with Pentagon bureaucracy. I found his passion for supporting military objectives admirable, especially knowing how much better equipment could have helped during my own deployments. Our evenings followed an equally predictable and satisfying pattern. Marcus would return home around 7, usually carrying stories about demanding military officials or complex technical challenges that had consumed his day. We'd have dinner together, sometimes take out from our favorite barbecue place in town, sometimes something I'd prepared while working from my home office counseling veterans through video calls. He'd ask detailed questions about my work, showing genuine interest in the challenges facing transitioning service members and offering thoughtful suggestions for helping veterans navigate civilian employment opportunities. Marcus always seemed supportive of my counseling practice, even though it was clearly small-scale compared to his multi-million-dollar defense contracts. He'd encourage me to expand my client base, suggesting I could eventually build a consulting firm that worked with major corporations on veteran hiring initiatives. Weekends belonged to us completely. Saturday mornings meant sleeping late, then taking Ranger for long walks through the pine forests surrounding our property where Marcus would point out wildlife and share stories about his childhood hunting trips with his father. He claimed to have grown up on a small farm in rural Georgia, learning outdoor skills that made him appreciate our North Carolina setting. "See that deer trail?" he'd say, pointing to barely visible tracks through the underbrush. "That's a mature buck, probably 8 points, using this route to reach the creek every evening around sunset. When hunting season opens, we could set up a blind right over there and guarantee ourselves venison for the winter." We talked constantly about future hunting trips, fishing expeditions, and camping adventures that would combine his supposed outdoor expertise with my military survival training. Saturday evenings were for entertaining, and our farmhouse became the regular gathering place for Marcus's business associates and their families. I'd spend hours preparing elaborate meals and arranging our home to showcase the success Marcus had achieved in defense contracting. These dinner parties were where Marcus truly excelled, demonstrating the charisma and confidence that had initially attracted me to him. He was the perfect host, remembering personal details about everyone's children, asking follow-up questions about conversations from previous gatherings, and making each guest feel valued and important. Marcus would hold court in our living room, sharing carefully edited stories about his latest Pentagon meetings and discussing geopolitical strategies with the authority of someone who genuinely understood military operations. "Marcus, you should consider running for Congress," his friend Jackson would joke during these gatherings. "You understand defense policy better than most politicians, and you've got the communication skills to really make a difference." Marcus would laugh and deflect, claiming he was too busy building his business empire to consider public service, but I could see he enjoyed the recognition and respect these conversations generated. Sundays provided quieter moments for reflection and planning. We'd read newspapers over breakfast, Marcus focusing on defense industry publications while I caught up on Veterans Affairs news and local politics. Sometimes we'd drive to nearby towns, exploring antique shops and farmers' markets where Marcus would demonstrate surprising knowledge about everything from Civil War history to agricultural techniques. This area saw significant Confederate activity. During Sherman's March, he'd explain as we walked through historic downtown areas. The strategic value of these railroad connections made them prime targets for Union disruption tactics. Understanding historical military logistics helps me appreciate modern supply chain challenges in my current projects. His ability to connect historical knowledge with contemporary business applications impressed me and reinforced my belief in his expertise. Our financial situation appeared rock solid during this period. We maintained joint checking and savings. Accounts, though, Marcus handled most major financial decisions since he claimed his business background gave him superior understanding of investment strategies and tax implications. Every month, he'd show me detailed statements demonstrating steady growth in our retirement accounts and explaining market fluctuations that affected our portfolio performance. "We're building something substantial here, Sarah," he'd say, pulling me close as we reviewed our financial progress. "By the time you're ready to retire from counseling work, we'll have enough saved to travel anywhere you want. Maybe buy that cabin in the mountains you've always talked about." He was generous with unexpected gifts, surprising me with jewelry for our anniversary, planning spontaneous weekend trips to Asheville or Virginia Beach, and upgrading my workshop tools whenever he noticed I was struggling with outdated equipment. Success means nothing if I can't share it with the woman who sacrificed so much for our country, he'd say whenever I protested that something was too expensive. Marcus seemed to genuinely appreciate my military service and wanted to ensure I felt valued and cared for after years of dangerous deployments and difficult transitions. The life insurance policies entered our conversation during one of these financial planning sessions about 14 months ago. Marcus had prepared comprehensive spreadsheets and charts showing our assets, liabilities, and projected retirement scenarios, displaying the same attention to detail that characterized his supposed defense contracting work. "There's one significant gap in our financial security," he said, highlighting a section marked in red on his analysis. "If something happened to either of us, the surviving spouse would face serious economic hardship. We need substantial life insurance coverage to protect the lifestyle we've built together." The logic seemed flawless given our circumstances and future plans. We owned the farmhouse, had monthly payments on both vehicles, and maintained a standard of living that reflected Marcus's business success. If he died, I'd lose his substantial income from government contracts. If I died, he'd lose my contribution to our household expenses, plus the potential earning capacity from expanding my counseling practice into a larger consulting firm. "How much coverage are we considering?" I asked, reviewing his detailed calculations and projected expenses. $2.5 million each should provide adequate protection," Marcus replied, showing me insurance calculators he'd researched online. "It sounds like a large amount, but when you factor in mortgage payments, maintaining the property, potential medical expenses as we age, and inflation over the next 30 years, it's actually conservative planning. The number seemed substantial, but Marcus's mathematical analysis was convincing. We were young, healthy, and had no significant medical issues that would complicate the application process. The monthly premiums would be manageable given our current income levels, and life insurance was exactly the type of responsible financial planning that separated successful couples from those who lived without considering future contingencies. "Do you really think we need that much coverage?" I asked, though his research appeared thorough and well-reasoned. Marcus pulled up additional insurance industry resources, showing me formulas for calculating replacement income and future financial obligations that supported his recommendations. Trust me, sweetheart. I've seen what happens to military families who don't plan properly for unexpected tragedies. We're not going to be those people who leave our surviving spouse struggling with financial problems on top of grief. So we completed the application process together, with Marcus handling most of the complex paperwork since he understood insurance regulations better than I did. We underwent medical examinations, answered detailed questions about our health histories and lifestyle choices, and provided comprehensive financial documentation to support our coverage amounts. The entire process took about 2 months, but eventually we were approved for the full amounts Marcus had calculated. "Perfect," he said when the final policy documents arrived. "Now we're completely protected regardless of what life throws at us. We can focus on building our future together without worrying about financial catastrophe." I felt secure, loved, and grateful to have married someone who planned so carefully for our long-term welfare and happiness. What I didn't understand at the time was that while I was feeling protected and cherished, Marcus was actually implementing the opening phase of my assassination. The man I trusted to safeguard our future was using my own life insurance policy as the financial foundation for my murder, and every loving gesture was calculated to maintain my trust while he prepared to kill me for money. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a Wednesday afternoon in September, about 10 months after we'd finalized the life insurance policies. I was in my home office conducting a video counseling session with a veteran struggling with employment transitions when I heard Marcus's phone buzzing persistently from the kitchen counter. He was outside in the barn, supposedly reviewing blueprints for a new Pentagon facility design, and the sound was becoming increasingly disruptive to my session. I walked over to silence the device, not intending to invade his privacy, but the name displayed on the screen made me pause. Kira Valencquez had been calling repeatedly for the past 15 minutes, generating 17 missed calls from the same number. The persistence suggested an emergency or urgent business matter that required Marcus's immediate attention. When Marcus came inside 20 minutes later, I mentioned the calls casually. "Someone named Kira Valencquez has been trying to reach you. Urgently," I said, pointing toward his phone. "Might be important." Marcus's face underwent a subtle transformation that I almost missed, a brief flash of something that looked like panic before he forced his usual confident smile. "Oh, that's Kira Valencquez, one of my subcontractors," he said, grabbing his phone and heading toward the garage. "Probably just anxious about the timeline for the Riverside project. You know how these smaller companies get when they're dealing with Pentagon deadlines." But through the kitchen window, I watched Marcus pace frantically in our driveway for 30 minutes, his free hand gesturing aggressively as he spoke. This didn't resemble a casual business update about project timelines. This looked like crisis management, damage control, or potentially something much worse. That evening, curiosity overcame my usual respect for Marcus's business privacy. I searched online for Kira Valencquez Defense Contractor, North Carolina, and found nothing. No company listings, no professional profiles, no business registrations that matched the description Marcus had provided. This seemed unusual considering he'd described her as an established subcontractor working on multi-million-dollar Pentagon projects. When Marcus returned home that evening, I tested his story again with seemingly innocent questions. How long have you been working with Kira Valencquez? I asked while we prepared dinner together. She seemed really concerned about reaching you today. About 6 months now, Marcus replied without hesitation. She handles specialized electronics, integration for the Riverside project. Very talented engineer, but she gets nervous when she can't reach primary contractors immediately. These government projects make everyone paranoid about communication gaps. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about Marcus's body language bothered me. He was unconsciously rotating his wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd noticed during stressful periods but had never connected to deception. His eye contact was also slightly off, focusing just over my shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly. The second warning sign emerged 2 weeks later during what should have been a routine evening. I was organizing Marcus's truck for him, something I occasionally did as a thoughtful gesture, when I discovered a receipt tucked behind his registration papers. Ruth's Chris Steakhouse in Charlotte, dated the previous Thursday, showing a bill for $238 for dinner for 2 people. The date corresponded exactly with an evening when Marcus had claimed to be working late on. Technical specifications for a Pentagon deadline. More troubling was the restaurant choice itself. Marcus had always claimed Ruth's Chris was overpriced and pretentious, complaining whenever I suggested we try it for special occasions. He'd specifically said their steaks were tourist trap garbage that no sensible person would pay premium prices for. So why was he eating there with someone else? And why had he lied about his whereabouts that evening? When I confronted him about the receipt, Marcus had another perfectly logical explanation. That was a business dinner with Kira Valencquez and her technical supervisor, he said without missing a beat. The Pentagon liaison suggested we take them somewhere impressive to discuss the electronics integration challenges they've been facing. Sometimes you have to swallow your personal preferences for the sake of important business relationships. Again, his reasoning seemed sound, but Marcus was displaying that nervous ring rotation again, and he'd avoided mentioning Kira Valencquez's supervisor previously. I was starting to notice how his stories became more elaborate when questioned, adding details that hadn't appeared in his original explanations. The third incident occurred in early October when Marcus left his laptop open on our kitchen table, while taking a phone call outside. I wasn't intentionally snooping, but as I walked past, an email notification caught my attention. The subject line read, "Confirmation, Paradise Beach Resort, Cancun," and the sender was listed as Paradise Reservations. My pulse quickened as I read what I could see without touching his computer. The booking was for November 22nd through December 5th, almost 2 weeks in Mexico. 2 guests, oceanfront suite, premium package including spa services and water sports activities. The confirmation number was addressed to Marcus Thompson, but the email address wasn't his usual business account. Instead, it was something called marcus.consulting.max, an address I'd never seen before. When Marcus returned from his call, I decided to test his honesty directly. "Have you given any more thought to our winter vacation plans?" I asked casually. "Maybe somewhere warm would be nice after this cold snap we've been having." "Funny you should mention that," Marcus replied, closing his laptop immediately. "I've been researching some possibilities. Actually found a great resort in Cancun that might work perfectly. Paradise Beach Resort, supposed to have amazing amenities, and the kind of relaxation we both need." "Sounds expensive," I said, watching his facial expressions carefully. "Can we afford something that luxurious right now?" "The Riverside contract should generate its final payment before Thanksgiving," he answered smoothly. "We've earned the right to celebrate properly, and Paradise Beach offers exactly the kind of romantic getaway that'll help us reconnect after this stressful project period." The conversation seemed normal on the surface, but several details bothered me deeply. Marcus had described the resort as if he'd just discovered it, when clearly he'd already made reservations. The timeline he'd mentioned, November 22nd, through December 5th, seemed unusually long for someone who constantly claimed his business required constant attention and availability. Most concerning was that mysterious email address. Why would Marcus maintain a Mexican email account for a vacation booking? And why hadn't he mentioned this communication method before? The fourth warning sign was the most obvious, though I initially tried to rationalize it away. I was grocery shopping at our usual store in Fayetteville when I encountered Jennifer Hawkins, wife of one of Marcus's supposed business partners. We'd met at several dinner parties Marcus had hosted, and she'd always been friendly and conversational. "Sarah, wonderful to see you," Jennifer said, approaching me near the produce section. "I feel like it's been forever since we've seen you, and Marcus at any industry gatherings. Is everything okay with his business?" I was confused by her question. "What do you mean?" "Marcus has been incredibly busy with the Riverside project, but we were just at the Caldwell reception last month. Marcus had specifically told me about networking with Pentagon liaisons and potential subcontractors at that event." Jennifer looked genuinely puzzled. "The Caldwell reception? Sarah, my husband, and I organized that event. You and Marcus definitely weren't there, and we haven't seen him at any defense contractor meetings in at least 4 months. Richard was actually asking about Marcus just last week, wondering if he'd shifted to different market sectors." My stomach dropped as the implications of Jennifer's words sank in. Marcus had provided detailed descriptions of conversations he'd supposedly had at the Caldwell reception, including specific people he'd met and business cards he'd collected from potential clients. He'd even shown me some of those business cards and explained the strategic opportunities they represented. I managed to laugh off the confusion, making excuses about mixed-up dates and overlapping social commitments, but internally I was reeling. Marcus had constructed an elaborate fictional account of an event he'd never attended, complete with specific details that couldn't have been accidentally misremembered. That evening, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. While Marcus showered, I systematically searched through his suit pockets, looking for evidence that might explain the growing list of inconsistencies in his stories. What I discovered made my blood run cold. I found business cards from companies that didn't exist when I checked them online. Restaurant receipts from establishments Marcus had never mentioned visiting, all for meals for 2 people. A parking stub from Raleigh-Durham Airport dated 3 days earlier, a day when Marcus had supposedly been in meetings locally all day. But the most disturbing discovery was a handwritten note in Marcus's distinctive writing. The paper was folded, small and tucked deep in his jacket pocket, as if he'd been trying to keep it completely hidden. The note contained what appeared to be a timeline with cryptic entries. K confirm final transfer NOV 15, weather window NOV 18 to 20, asset liquidation complete NOV 22, departure sequence initiated. I stared at that note until my hands started shaking. The timeline corresponded roughly with our supposed vacation dates, but the language sounded nothing like vacation planning. Asset liquidation and departure sequence suggested something far more sinister than a romantic getaway to Cancun. The initial K matched the name from those persistent phone calls, K Valencia. But now I was beginning to suspect that Kelly Valencia wasn't a defense subcontractor at all. The timing, the secrecy, the mysterious email accounts, and this threatening timeline all pointed towards something much darker than business stress or even a simple affair. I carefully photographed the note with my phone and returned everything to exactly where I'd found it, then lay in bed next to my sleeping husband trying to process what I'd discovered. Either Marcus was involved in some kind of illegal business activity, or he was planning something that required asset liquidation and departure sequences, terminology that sounded disturbingly like military operation planning. But as I listened to Marcus's steady breathing and studied his peaceful expression in the darkness, a more terrifying possibility began forming in my mind. What if I was the asset being liquidated? What if our vacation to Cancun wasn't a romantic getaway, but the operational location for something much more sinister? The life insurance policies, the secretive phone calls, the fictional business meetings, the mysterious timeline, everything. was starting to form a pattern that made my military training scream warnings I'd been too trusting to hear. Marcus wasn't just lying about his business activities. He was planning something that required my disappearance, and our supposed vacation might be the perfect cover for making that happen. I was no longer dealing with a husband having an affair, or struggling with business problems. I was potentially living with someone planning my murder, and our romantic Mexican getaway might be designed as the scene of my death. After discovering that ominous handwritten note, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Marcus, listening to his steady breathing and studying his peaceful expression, while my mind raced through the implications of what I'd found. The woman who had trusted blindly for 3 years was gone, replaced by someone whose Marine Corps intelligence training was finally kicking into high gear. I started paying attention to everything in a way I never had before, cataloging every detail with the methodical precision I'd once used to identify insurgent activities in Afghanistan. When Marcus's phone rang the next morning, I memorized the caller's name before he could grab it. When he left for supposed meetings, I noted the exact time, what he was wearing, and which direction his truck headed. When he returned with stories about his day, I listened for inconsistencies with the focused attention I'd once reserved for interrogating suspected enemy collaborators. It didn't take long to compile a disturbing list of discrepancies. The next morning, Marcus announced he had a crucial meeting with Pentagon procurement officials about the Riverside project's final specifications. "This could be the approval we've been waiting for," he said, adjusting his navy blue tie with unusual nervousness. "If the technical review goes well, we could see contract finalization within 2 weeks." After he left, I did something that would have seemed paranoid just days earlier. I called the Pentagon's main switchboard and asked to be transferred to procurement operations. After navigating through several departments, I finally reached someone who could check meeting schedules for defense contractors. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have any meetings scheduled today with external contractors regarding guidance system projects," the administrative assistant told me. "Our next contractor briefings aren't until next month, and those are already fully booked with pre-approved participants." My hands were trembling as I hung up the phone. Marcus had lied directly and specifically about his whereabouts, creating fictional government meetings with the same casual confidence he'd once used to describe his childhood on that non-existent Georgia farm. I decided to follow him, something I'd never imagined myself doing in our marriage, but that felt absolutely necessary given the mounting evidence of deception. I waited 20 minutes after his departure, then got in my Mustang and drove toward town, taking the route Marcus always used for his supposed Pentagon meetings. I found his truck in the parking lot of a Hampton Inn about 30 minutes from our house. Through the hotel's glass lobby doors, I could see Marcus sitting at the bar with a woman who definitely wasn't Kira Valencquez, the supposed defense subcontractor. This woman was young, probably late 20s, with long black hair and the kind of figure that suggested personal training or fitness instruction. She was wearing workout clothes that looked expensive and professional. I watched them for almost 3 hours from my car, documenting their interaction with the same attention to detail I'd once used for surveillance operations overseas. They ordered drinks, then lunch, talking animatedly throughout the meal. The woman frequently touched Marcus's arm, leaned in close when she spoke, and displayed the kind of physical intimacy that clearly indicated a romantic relationship rather than business partnership. When they finally stood up to leave, Marcus placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her toward the elevators. They were going upstairs together, to a hotel room, during what he'd claimed was a crucial Pentagon meeting that would determine our financial future. I drove home in a fog of betrayal and confusion, trying to process the magnitude of Marcus's deception. Not only was he having an affair, but he'd constructed elaborate lies about government contracts, Pentagon meetings, and business success to cover his activities. The expensive lifestyle we'd been living, the confident talks about our financial security, the detailed planning for our future. Everything had been built on deception. When Marcus returned that evening, He was unusually animated and optimistic. "Fantastic news, sweetheart," he said, kissing my cheek enthusiastically. The Pentagon meeting exceeded all expectations. They're fast-tracking the Riverside approval process, and we should see contract finalization before Thanksgiving. We're looking at the biggest payday of my career. I stared at him. This man who could lie so effortlessly about spending the afternoon in a hotel room with another woman. "Tell me about the meeting," I said, testing how far his fabrication would extend. "What specific concerns did they raise about the technical specifications?" Marcus launched into a 20-minute fictional account of detailed discussions with Pentagon officials who didn't exist, technical challenges that had never been addressed, and approval processes that were complete fantasy. Every word was delivered with the confidence of someone who had no idea his wife had spent the afternoon watching him commit adultery. I excused myself to the bathroom and threw up. The man I'd loved and trusted for 3 years was a pathological liar capable of maintaining complex deceptions without any visible signs of guilt or remorse. If he could lie so convincingly about his daily activities, what else was he capable of hiding? Over the following days, I started conducting what my military training had taught me to call pattern analysis, systematically documenting Marcus's behaviors and looking for connections I'd previously missed. I began noticing things that should have raised red flags months or even years earlier. Marcus's phone was now always face down and within his immediate reach, never casually abandoned on counters the way it used to be. His credit card statements, which I rarely examined closely, showed charges at restaurants and hotels I'd never been to, all for amounts that suggested meals or accommodations for 2 people. His laptop, once left open and accessible around the house, was now password-protected and never left unattended. Most tellingly, Marcus had started taking phone calls outside or in the garage, claiming his business required privacy for sensitive government communications. When I'd offer to give him space by leaving the room, he'd insist that wasn't necessary, then immediately step outside anyway. The breakthrough came when I decided to use skills I'd learned during military intelligence training. While Marcus was in the shower, I quickly accessed his laptop using a password recovery technique we'd been taught for extracting information from captured enemy devices. His email account revealed a completely different life than the one he'd been sharing with me. The correspondence with Kira Valencquez told a story that made my blood run cold. Her real name was Kira Valencquez, and she wasn't a defense contractor. According to their email exchanges, she was a personal trainer from Charlotte who'd been Marcus's lover for at least 8 months. But more disturbing than the affair itself was the content of their conversations. Marcus had been systematically lying to Kira about our marriage, telling her I was mentally unstable due to combat trauma and that he was planning to leave me as soon as he could secure his financial position. He'd described me as unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and completely dependent on him for emotional and financial support. But the emails from the past month revealed something far more sinister. Marcus and Kira had been discussing what they called the Mexico solution, a plan that would allow Marcus to start fresh without the complications of divorce proceedings or property division. They referenced the Paradise Beach Resort reservation and discussed making sure the transition happens smoothly during the vacation. One email from Kira made my hands shake as I read it. "Are you sure about the timeline? This seems really risky, especially with her military background. What if she suspects something?" Marcus's response was chilling. "Trust me, she's too damaged by her war experiences to think clearly. PTSD has made her paranoid and unstable. If something happens to her, in Mexico, everyone will assume it was suicide related to combat trauma. The life insurance investigation will be routine." I sat in our kitchen staring at Marcus's laptop screen, finally understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just an affair or financial fraud. Marcus was planning to murder me during our Mexico vacation and make it look like a PTSD-related suicide. The life insurance money would fund his new life with Kira, and my military service record would provide the perfect cover story for my death. The asset liquidation, referenced in his handwritten note, wasn't about business equipment or investments. I was the asset being liquidated. The departure sequence was their plan to escape to Mexico, kill me, and disappear with $2.5 million while everyone believed my death was a tragic consequence of war trauma. I continued reading their correspondence, discovering that Marcus had been researching my medical records, my VA psychiatric evaluations, and the suicide rates among female combat veterans. He'd been building a psychological profile that would support the narrative of my mental breakdown, gathering evidence that would convince insurance investigators and law enforcement that my death was self-inflicted. Kira had been helping him plan the operational details. They'd researched remote locations near the Paradise Beach Resort, where an accident could occur without witnesses. They'd discussed how to ensure my body would be found in a way that supported their suicide theory, and they'd even practiced their emotional responses for when Marcus would have to report my death to Mexican authorities. But the most damning evidence was an email Marcus had sent just 2 days earlier. The VA psychiatrist confirmed the appointment for next week. Once we have his official assessment of her deteriorating mental state on record, we'll have everything we need for Mexico. The insurance company will never question a suicide ruling when there's recent professional documentation of severe PTSD symptoms. I realized with horror that Marcus had scheduled a VA appointment I knew nothing about, presumably planning to forge my signature or somehow manipulate a psychiatric evaluation that would support his murder plot. He was creating a paper trail that would justify my death, building evidence that would convince everyone I'd taken my own life, rather than been murdered for insurance money. The scope of his planning was both terrifying and impressive. Marcus had thought through every detail, anticipated every question that might arise, and prepared answers that would protect him from suspicion. He'd turned my military service, something I was proud of, into the weapon he planned to use to justify my murder. But as I sat there processing the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal, something else was happening. The shocked, betrayed wife was disappearing, replaced by the Marine Corps intelligence officer who'd spent 3 years in combat zones identifying and neutralizing threats to American personnel. Marcus thought he was dealing with a damaged veteran too traumatized to recognize danger, but he was actually planning to murder someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this kind of threat assessment and response. I carefully photographed every relevant email, documenting the entire conspiracy with the same methodical precision I'd once used to build cases against insurgent networks. Then I began developing what my military training called a counter-operation strategy, because Marcus Thompson was about to discover that his supposedly broken veteran wife had learned a few things about eliminating threats during her time in Afghanistan. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the predator who thought he'd chosen the perfect victim was actually about to face someone trained by the United States Marine Corps to win at any cost. Discovering the full scope of Marcus's murder conspiracy changed everything inside me. The shocked, betrayed wife disappeared completely, replaced by the Marine Corps intelligence specialist who had spent 3 years in Afghanistan identifying and eliminating threats to American forces. As I sat in our kitchen, staring at the evidence of my husband's plan to kill me for insurance money, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my last combat deployment. The cold, calculating focus that had kept me alive in the most dangerous places on Earth. Marcus thought he was dealing with a damaged veteran too traumatized by war to recognize the danger sleeping next to her every night. He had no idea that his supposedly broken wife had been trained by the most effective military in the world to identify, analyze, and neutralize threats from any direction. The predator who believed he'd chosen the perfect victim was about to discover that he'd actually targeted someone whose entire professional training had been designed for exactly this situation. I began by conducting what military intelligence calls a comprehensive threat assessment, systematically analyzing every aspect of Marcus's operation to understand his capabilities, resources, timeline, and vulnerabilities. The emails I'd discovered provided crucial intelligence about his planning process, but I needed to understand the complete picture before developing an effective counter-strategy. First, I needed to verify whether the VA appointment Marcus had referenced was real or fictional. If he'd actually scheduled a psychiatric evaluation using forged documents or manipulation, that appointment could be crucial evidence of premeditation. I called the VA Medical Center in Fayetteville and asked to speak with the psychiatric department about my treatment schedule. Mrs. Thompson, yes, we do have you scheduled for an emergency evaluation next Tuesday at 10 a.m., the receptionist confirmed. Your husband called yesterday expressing concern about your mental state and requesting urgent assessment for potential hospitalization. Dr. Brennan has cleared his schedule to accommodate what your husband described as a psychiatric crisis requiring immediate intervention. My blood turned to ice. Marcus had scheduled a psychiatric evaluation without my knowledge, claiming I was experiencing a mental health emergency that required professional intervention. He was creating official medical documentation that would support his murder plot, establishing a paper trail showing my supposedly deteriorating mental condition just weeks before my planned death in Mexico. What specific concerns did my husband report? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through the implications of this manipulation. According to his report, you've been experiencing increased paranoia, violent outbursts, and expressions of suicidal ideation related to your combat trauma, the receptionist read from her notes. He indicated that you've been having flashbacks that make you dangerous to yourself and others, and that he's afraid to leave you alone for extended periods. Every word was a calculated lie designed to build the psychological profile Marcus needed for his insurance fraud scheme. He was systematically destroying my reputation and credibility while positioning himself as the concerned husband, trying to help his mentally unstable veteran wife. When I died in Mexico, everyone would remember that Marcus had been desperately seeking professional help for my deteriorating condition. I canceled the appointment immediately, claiming scheduling conflicts, but the damage was already partially done. Marcus had initiated official medical procedures that created records of my supposed mental health crisis, and he could easily reschedule or find other ways to establish the documentation he needed. Next, I investigated the financial aspects of Marcus's operation, using online banking access to trace money movements I'd been ignoring for months. What I discovered was even more extensive than I'd initially realized. Marcus had been systematically draining our joint accounts, transferring funds to offshore banking institutions in countries with limited cooperation with American law enforcement. Over the past 6 months, he'd moved nearly $400,000 from our savings and investment accounts to banks in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Mexico. Each transfer had been structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements spread across multiple dates and amounts that wouldn't raise immediate red flags with financial monitoring systems. But Marcus had made a crucial mistake. Several of the transfers included my forged signature on authorization documents, and I could prove the forgeries by comparing them with my actual signature on file with our bank. He'd been practicing my handwriting, but his reproductions contained subtle differences that would be obvious to forensic document analysts. I photographed every fraudulent document, creating evidence that would prove Marcus had been stealing our money for months while planning my murder. The financial fraud alone was enough to send him to prison for decades, but combined with the murder conspiracy, it painted a picture of systematic criminal planning that would convince any jury of his guilt. The investigation into Kira Valencquez revealed additional layers of deception that helped me understand the complete scope of their operation. According to social media profiles and professional websites, she wasn't just Marcus's lover. She was an experienced con artist with a history of targeting wealthy men in committed relationships. Kira had been married twice before, both times to men who died in suspicious accidents shortly after taking out substantial life insurance policies. Her first husband died in a skiing accident in Colorado 3 years ago, resulting in a $1.8 million insurance payout. Her second husband drowned during a fishing trip in Florida 18 months later, generating another $2.2 million in insurance settlements. The pattern was obvious once I knew what to look for. Kira specialized in seducing married men, convincing them to murder their wives for insurance money, then disappearing with the proceeds once the crimes were completed. She was a professional black widow who had refined her methods through multiple successful operations. But the most chilling discovery was evidence that Kira and Marcus were already planning their next target. Their email correspondence referenced a backup opportunity in South Carolina involving a wealthy widow with substantial assets and no immediate family. They were treating murder like a business, developing a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating victims for financial gain. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own survival. I was potentially the third victim in a series, and if I didn't stop them, other innocent women would die to fund their criminal lifestyle. This knowledge transformed my mission from personal survival to a broader responsibility to prevent future murders. The timeline analysis revealed that Marcus and Kira were operating under significant pressure. According to their communications, they owed money to dangerous people who were demanding payment by Christmas. Marcus's fictional defense contracting business had apparently been used as cover for some kind of criminal activity that had gone wrong, leaving them with debts that required immediate resolution. The Mexico vacation wasn't just convenient timing. For my murder, it was a deadline imposed by external threats that Marcus hadn't mentioned in his communications with me. If they didn't deliver the insurance money by early December, they would face consequences that went beyond financial problems. This external pressure was both an advantage and a disadvantage for my situation. It meant Marcus was operating under stress that might cause him to make mistakes, but it also meant he was committed to the timeline regardless of potential complications. He couldn't postpone or modify his plans without facing threats from his criminal associates. I needed allies, but I couldn't trust local law enforcement with this information without risking Marcus's discovery of my investigation. If he learned that I'd uncovered his plot, he might accelerate his timeline or modify his methods in ways that would make him harder to stop. I needed to maintain operational security while building a case that would guarantee his conviction. The solution came from my military network. During my time in Afghanistan, I'd worked closely with a military police investigator named Detective Rosa Martinez, who had transitioned to civilian law enforcement after her discharge. Rosa was now a detective with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, specializing in complex criminal conspiracies involving military personnel. I called Rosa from a burner phone I'd purchased with cash, explaining that I needed confidential assistance with a situation involving potential threats against a veteran. Without revealing specific details about Marcus's plot, I described a hypothetical scenario involving insurance fraud and domestic violence targeting a female veteran. "Sarah, this sounds like something that requires immediate federal involvement," Rosa said after listening to my carefully edited description. "If you're dealing with interstate financial crimes combined with threats against military personnel, we need to bring in the FBI. I have contacts in their white-collar crime division who specialize in exactly these types of cases." Within 48 hours, Rosa had connected me with Special Agent Jennifer Park, an FBI investigator who had extensive experience with insurance fraud conspiracies. Agent Park agreed to meet me at a secure location to review the evidence I'd collected and assess whether federal intervention was warranted. The meeting took place at a coffee shop in Raleigh, far enough from our home that Marcus wouldn't accidentally discover my activities. Agent Park was a small, intense woman who listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had seen similar cases before. "Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing represents multiple federal crimes including wire fraud, conspiracy, to commit murder and racketeering," she said after reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. "The interstate nature of the financial transfers and the use of electronic communications for criminal planning gives us clear federal jurisdiction. Agent Park explained that the FBI had been tracking similar insurance fraud schemes involving romantic partnerships and suspicious deaths. Kira Valencquez was already a person of interest in connection with her previous husband's deaths, though they hadn't been able to develop sufficient evidence for prosecution. Your case gives us the opportunity to catch them in the act rather than investigating after the fact, Agent Park continued. If you're willing to cooperate with a federal investigation, we can document their entire operation and ensure they face appropriate consequences for their crimes. The FBI's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would continue playing the unsuspecting wife while wearing recording devices that would capture Marcus and Kira's conversations about their murder plot. Federal agents would monitor our communications, track their financial activities, and document every aspect of their conspiracy. When Marcus attempted to execute his plan in Mexico, FBI agents working with Mexican law enforcement would be positioned to intervene and arrest both conspirators. The recorded conversations, combined with the financial evidence and documented timeline, would provide overwhelming proof of their criminal intent. But the plan required me to maintain my cover for another 3 weeks, continuing to live with Marcus while knowing he was planning to kill me. I would have to smile, act loving, and participate in vacation planning while federal agents gathered evidence for what they promised would be an airtight case. Can you handle the psychological pressure of this operation? Agent Park asked. Living with someone who's planning your murder requires extraordinary emotional control. Most civilians couldn't manage it without breaking down or revealing their knowledge. I looked at her steadily. Agent Park, I spent 3 years living in forward operating bases where insurgents were constantly trying to kill American personnel. I've been shot at, mortared, and targeted by suicide bombers. I think I can handle sharing a house with one amateur murderer for 3 more weeks. Agent Park smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Let's make sure Marcus Thompson and Kira Valencquez spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. As I drove home from that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since returning from Afghanistan: the satisfaction of having a clear mission with defined objectives and the resources necessary to accomplish them. Marcus thought he was hunting a helpless victim, but he was actually about to face a combat veteran backed by the full investigative power of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the predator who believed he'd identified the perfect victim was walking into a trap designed by someone trained to eliminate threats to American citizens. Building the counter-strategy against Marcus required the same methodical precision I'd once used to coordinate intelligence operations in Afghanistan. The difference was that instead of identifying insurgent networks threatening American forces, I was now documenting a murder conspiracy targeting me specifically. Agent Park had provided me with sophisticated recording equipment disguised as everyday jewelry and accessories, along with detailed instructions for gathering evidence that would guarantee Marcus's conviction. The first challenge was maintaining operational security while living in the same house as my target. Marcus had become increasingly paranoid about privacy, constantly checking his phone and laptop for signs of interference. If he discovered my investigation, he might accelerate his timeline or modify his methods in ways that would make him impossible to catch. I needed to act like the naive, trusting wife he expected, while systematically documenting his criminal activities. The recording equipment included a necklace with a hidden microphone capable of capturing conversations from across a room, earrings equipped with GPS tracking that would allow the FBI to monitor my location constantly, and a bracelet containing a panic button that would summon immediate federal response if Marcus attempted to harm me before the planned Mexico operation. Agent Park had also provided me with specialized software for my phone that would secretly transmit copies of all Marcus's communications to federal servers. Every text message, email, and phone call would be preserved as evidence, creating a comprehensive record of his conspiracy that would be impossible to deny in court. Remember, your safety is the primary objective, Agent Park had emphasized during our training session. We want to catch them, but not at the cost of your life. If anything feels wrong or dangerous, activate the panic button immediately. We'll have agents positioned throughout the area who can respond within minutes. The psychological challenge of the operation was more difficult than I'd anticipated. Living with Marcus while knowing he was planning to murder me required constant, emotional control that pushed even my military training to its limits. Every morning, I had to smile and kiss the man who was counting down the days until my death. Every evening, I had to listen to his fictional stories about work while knowing he was actually spending his time planning my assassination. The most disturbing aspect was how normal Marcus acted during this period. He continued bringing me flowers, planning romantic dinners, and discussing our future together as if he genuinely cared about our relationship. The cognitive dissonance between his loving behavior and his murderous intentions was almost impossible to process rationally. "You seem tense lately, sweetheart," Marcus said one evening as we prepared dinner together. "Is everything okay?" "I know the transition from military life has been challenging, and I want to make sure you're getting the support you need." The irony was staggering. The man planning to kill me for insurance money was expressing concern about my mental health and offering emotional support. Either Marcus was a more sophisticated actor than I'd given him credit for, or some part of him genuinely believed his lies about caring for my welfare. "I've just been having some difficulty sleeping," I replied, which was completely true, though, not for the reasons he assumed. "Maybe I should talk to someone at the VA about adjusting my medication." Marcus's eyes lit up with interest that now seemed sinister rather than caring. "That's a great idea. In fact, I was thinking the same thing. Why don't I call Dr. Brennan's office tomorrow and see if we can get you an appointment? It's important to address these issues before they become more serious." He was trying to manipulate me into the psychiatric evaluation that would support his murder plot, using my own words against me to justify medical intervention. The recording device in my necklace captured every word of this conversation, preserving evidence of how Marcus was attempting to establish documentation of my supposed mental deterioration. The financial investigation revealed additional layers of Marcus's criminal activities that even the FBI hadn't initially suspected. While monitoring his electronic communications, Agent Park discovered that Marcus was involved in a complex money laundering operation that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. "Your husband has been moving money for a criminal organization based in Mexico," Agent Park explained during one of our covert meetings. The defense contracting business was completely fictional, but it provided cover for transferring funds from drug trafficking operations into legitimate-appearing business accounts. Marcus owed the cartel nearly $2 million that he'd lost through failed investments and personal spending, including the expensive lifestyle he'd been maintaining during our marriage. My life insurance money wasn't just going to fund his new life with Kira. It was going to save his life by paying off debts to people who would kill him if he defaulted on his obligations. This information explained the external pressure driving Marcus's timeline and his commitment to the Mexico operation regardless of potential risks. He wasn't just planning my murder for financial gain. He was planning it for survival. If he didn't deliver the insurance money by Christmas, he would become a target himself. "Does this change the operational plan?" I asked, concerned that cartel involvement might complicate the FBI's ability to protect me during the Mexico phase of the investigation. "Actually, it strengthens our case significantly," Agent Park replied. "Money laundering for drug cartels is a federal crime that carries mandatory minimum sentences. Even if we couldn't prove the murder conspiracy, the financial crimes alone would put Marcus in prison for decades." But Agent Park also warned that cartel involvement made Marcus more dangerous and unpredictable. People who owe money to drug trafficking organizations are capable of extreme violence when they're desperate. Marcus might try to accelerate his timeline if he suspects we're closing in on him. The investigation into Kira revealed that she was wanted by law enforcement agencies in 3 states for her involvement in previous insurance fraud schemes. The FBI had been tracking her activities for 2 years, but she'd been careful to avoid leaving evidence that would support criminal charges. Kira Valencquez is one of the most sophisticated Black Widow killers we've encountered, Agent Park explained. She specializes in identifying wealthy men in troubled marriages, seducing them away from their wives, then convincing them to commit murder for insurance money. Once the crime is completed, she disappears with the proceeds and moves to a new location to find her next target. Kira's previous victims hadn't just been her husbands. She'd also convinced other men to kill their wives, collecting portions of the insurance payouts while avoiding direct involvement in the murders themselves. She was essentially running a murder-for-hire operation disguised as romantic relationships. "How many women has she killed?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We suspect at least 7 deaths over the past 5 years, but we've only been able to prove involvement in 2 cases. Your cooperation gives us the chance to document her entire methodology and link her to previous crimes through pattern evidence." The recorded conversations between Marcus and Kira provided crucial insights into their operational planning and psychological dynamics. Marcus was clearly the junior partner in their relationship, following Kira's instructions and deferring to her experience with murder conspiracies. "Are you sure about the timeline?" I heard Marcus ask during one of their phone calls. "The cartel contact is getting impatient, and I'm worried about what happens if we don't deliver the money on schedule." "Stop worrying so much," Kira replied with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed similar operations before. "The Mexico plan is foolproof. Tourist deaths happen all the time in resort areas, especially when alcohol and water activities are involved. The local authorities will assume she drowned accidentally, the insurance company will pay out within 60 days, and will be living comfortably in South America before anyone asks difficult questions." Their casual discussion of my death was chilling, but it also provided evidence of premeditation that would guarantee their conviction for first-degree murder conspiracy. They weren't planning a crime of passion or spontaneous violence. They were methodically organizing my assassination with the same attention to detail that legitimate businesses use for project planning. The most damaging evidence came from a conversation where Kira coached Marcus on how to behave during the murder itself. "Remember, you have to seem genuinely shocked and devastated when it happens," she instructed. "Cry real tears, call for help immediately, and make sure the resort staff see you trying to save her. The more dramatic your emotional response, the less likely anyone will suspect you're involved." "What if she fights back?" Marcus asked. "She's got military training and she might be stronger than we expect." "That's why we're using the drowning method," Kira explained. "Once she's in the water and disoriented, her training won't help her. Just make sure she's had enough to drink at dinner that her reflexes are impaired. The combination of alcohol and water will make resistance impossible." They were planning to drug me during our romantic dinner, then take me to a secluded beach area where Marcus would hold me underwater until I drowned. The recording captured every detail of their methodology, creating evidence that would be impossible for any defense attorney to explain away. But the most revealing conversation occurred when Marcus expressed doubts about their plan. "Sometimes I feel guilty about this," he admitted to Kira during a late-night phone call. "Sarah really loves me and she doesn't deserve what we're planning to do to her." "Don't be weak now," Kira responded sharply. "She's just a damaged veteran who never should have survived her deployments anyway. We're putting her out of her misery while solving your financial problems. Think of it as mercy killing combined with practical business." Her complete lack of empathy for my life confirmed that Kira was a sociopathic killer who viewed murder as a routine business transaction. The recording would demonstrate to any jury that she was the driving force behind the conspiracy and that Marcus was essentially her accomplice rather than the primary planner. Agent Park was particularly interested in the technical details of their murder plan. "The specificity of their methodology suggests they've used similar techniques before," she explained. "This recording gives us evidence we can use to reopen investigations into Kira's previous victims and potentially solve multiple cold cases." As the Mexico departure date approached, Marcus became increasingly nervous and attentive toward me. He started bringing me gifts almost daily, planning elaborate romantic activities, and expressing his love with an intensity that would have been touching if I hadn't known he was planning to kill me in less than 2 weeks. "I want our vacation to be perfect," he said one evening while we reviewed the resort brochures together. "We've both been under so much stress lately, and I think some time alone together in paradise will help us reconnect and remember why we fell in love in the first place." The tragic irony was that Marcus seemed to genuinely believe his own lies about our relationship. He'd compartmentalized his emotions so effectively that he could plan my murder while simultaneously expressing authentic-seeming affection for me. The psychological complexity of his delusion was almost as disturbing as the murder plot itself. But I was ready for him. The naive military wife who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by a Marine Corps intelligence specialist backed by the full investigative power of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus and Kira thought they were executing a perfect crime, but they were actually walking into a carefully constructed trap that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in federal prison. The final phase of the operation was about to begin, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when they realized that their supposedly helpless victim had outmaneuvered them at every turn. The Paradise Beach Resort in Cancun was everything Marcus had promised during his excited descriptions of our romantic getaway. Pristine white sand beaches stretched endlessly along turquoise waters. Luxury suites overlooked tropical gardens filled with hibiscus and palm trees, and world-class restaurants offered the kind of dining experiences that belonged in travel magazines rather than murder plots. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the perfect romantic vacation. Instead, it felt like the most beautiful execution chamber I'd ever seen. Marcus had booked us a premium oceanfront suite on the 7th floor with a panoramic view of the Caribbean Sea and direct access to a private beach area. As I stood on our balcony that first afternoon, watching boats move across the horizon in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder which secluded location Marcus had selected for my planned drowning. "Incredible view, isn't it?" Marcus said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist in what would have seemed like a loving gesture if I hadn't known he was calculating the logistics of my murder. "I thought we could spend tomorrow exploring the resort and maybe doing some shopping in town. Then Tuesday evening we'll have that special dinner I've been planning." Tuesday evening, November 22nd, according to the timeline I'd discovered in his notes. The date he'd scheduled for my death, perfectly coordinated with Kira's arrival and their escape plan to South America. "What kind of special dinner?" I asked, leaning back against him and trying to sound excited rather than terrified about my upcoming assassination. "It's a surprise," Marcus said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Let's just say it's something that will change everything for us. A celebration of our future together." Our future together. The man planning to drown me for insurance money was describing my murder as a celebration of our relationship. The psychological disconnection required to maintain such delusions was almost incomprehensible. That evening at the resort's main restaurant, Kira appeared with the kind of perfectly timed coincidence that would have seemed suspicious to anyone who wasn't supposed to be the victim of their conspiracy. She approached our table wearing a flowing white sundress that made her look like she belonged in a resort advertisement, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed similar operations before. "Marcus, Sarah, what an amazing coincidence running into you here," she said with an Oscar-worthy performance of surprise. "I'm here on business, but my meetings got canceled at the last minute. Would you mind if I joined you for dinner? I hate eating alone in these beautiful places." Marcus stood up and pulled out a chair for her as if her appearance was the delightful surprise he was pretending it to be. "Kira, of course, please join us. Sarah, this is Kira Valencquez, the electronics consultant I've been working with on the Riverside project." As she settled into her chair, I noticed she was wearing expensive jewelry that definitely hadn't come from an electronics consultant's salary. A diamond tennis bracelet, emerald earrings, and a watch that probably cost more than most people's annual income. Marcus's money was already funding her lifestyle, and my insurance payment would allow her to upgrade to even more luxurious accessories. "So, how do you like Paradise Beach?" I asked, with the innocent friendliness of someone who had no idea she was having dinner with her future murderer. "It's absolutely gorgeous," Kira replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about tomorrow evening. I have a very important business meeting that could determine my entire future." Tomorrow evening. She was talking about my murder with the same casual tone most people use to discuss routine business appointments. The recording device in my necklace captured every word, preserving evidence of how callously she discussed ending my life. "What kind of business meeting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Investment consulting," she said smoothly. "Very high-stakes financial planning that requires perfect timing and execution. The slightest mistake could be catastrophic for everyone involved." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with Marcus and Kira maintaining their charade while dropping increasingly obvious hints about their real relationship and criminal activities. Marcus's hand would briefly touch Kira's when he passed her the wine bottle. Kira would laugh at his jokes with the intimacy of someone who had heard them many times before in private settings. What they didn't realize was that FBI agents were positioned throughout the resort, documenting their every interaction and preparing for the intervention that would occur when they attempted to execute their murder plan. Agent Park had coordinated with Mexican law enforcement to ensure that when Marcus tried to kill me, multiple agencies would be ready to respond immediately. The next day, Marcus suggested we spend the afternoon exploring Cancun's shopping districts and cultural attractions. As we walked through markets filled with local crafts and artwork, he pointed out various locations with the casual interest of a tourist, rather than someone conducting reconnaissance for a murder operation. "Look at that beautiful beach area," he said, indicating a secluded cove about a mile from our resort. "That would be perfect for a private romantic dinner, don't you think? Very intimate, very peaceful." The location he was describing matched exactly with the coordinates I'd seen in his private notes. Marcus was showing me the site where he planned to drown me, describing my future murder scene as a romantic dinner location. "It looks lovely," I said, squeezing his arm with the affection of a wife who trusted her husband completely. "But aren't you worried about safety? Swimming in unfamiliar waters can be dangerous, especially after drinking wine with dinner." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused and calculating. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm an excellent swimmer, and I'll take good care of you. Nothing bad will happen as long as you trust me completely." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that anyone overhearing would have assumed he was being protective rather than threatening. But I heard the real message clearly. He was warning me not to resist when he tried to drown me. That afternoon, while Marcus took what he claimed was an important business call, I had my own meeting with Agent Park, who was posing as a resort guest enjoying vacation activities near the pool area. "Everything's in position for tonight," she said quietly, as we pretended to discuss snorkeling equipment rental options. "We've got surveillance teams monitoring the entire resort, underwater rescue specialists positioned along the coastline, and Mexican federal police coordinated with our operation." "What's the intervention protocol?" I asked, reviewing the tactical plan one final time. "The moment Marcus attempts to harm you, we move in with overwhelming force. Coast Guard vessels, helicopter support, and ground teams will converge on your die. Location simultaneously. Marcus and Kira will be arrested by joint American-Mexican task forces and transported to the United States for federal prosecution." Agent Park also confirmed that the financial investigation had uncovered additional evidence linking Marcus to the drug cartel money laundering operation. "We've traced over $4 million in transactions through accounts he controlled," she explained. Even without the murder conspiracy, the financial crimes alone guaranteed life sentences for both defendants. As evening approached, Marcus became increasingly nervous and attentive toward me. He insisted I wear the white dress he'd purchased for me during our shopping expedition, claiming it would be perfect for our special romantic dinner. The dress felt like funeral attire, but I smiled and thanked him for his thoughtfulness. "You look absolutely beautiful," he said as we prepared to leave our suite. "Tonight is going to be a night we'll never forget. A night we'll never forget." Marcus was describing my planned murder as a memorable romantic experience, demonstrating the complete psychological disconnection that allowed him to function as both loving husband and calculated killer. The restaurant Marcus had selected was an intimate beachfront establishment about 15 minutes from our resort, accessible only by taxi or rental car. As we drove through the tropical evening, Marcus kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch, clearly monitoring a timeline that corresponded with Kira's arrival and their coordinated murder plan. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked as we approached the restaurant. "You seem a little tense tonight." "Just excited about our romantic dinner," I replied, though my nervousness had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the knowledge that my husband was planning to kill me within the next few hours. The restaurant was exactly what Marcus had described: elegant, intimate, and positioned on a secluded stretch of beach that would provide perfect cover for the drowning he was planning to execute after dinner. Tables were arranged along the sand with tiki torches providing romantic lighting that would also make it difficult for potential witnesses to see clearly. Kira was already seated at a nearby table when we arrived, wearing a black cocktail dress and jewelry that sparkled in the torchlight. She waved casually as if her presence was another delightful coincidence rather than a carefully coordinated element of their murder conspiracy. "What a surprise seeing you here," Marcus said loudly enough for other diners to hear, establishing the fiction that Kira's presence was unexpected rather than planned. "Would you like to join us for dinner?" "I'd love to," Kira replied, moving to our table with the graceful confidence of someone who had successfully completed similar operations multiple times before. As we ordered wine and appetizers, I noticed Marcus was unusually insistent about my alcohol consumption. He kept refilling my glass, encouraging me to try different wines, and suggesting we order champagne to celebrate our romantic vacation. He was clearly attempting to impair my reflexes and judgment before attempting the drowning. "This wine is absolutely delicious," I said, taking small sips while pretending to drink much more than I actually consumed. "I feel so relaxed and happy being here with you." Marcus's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he watched what he believed was my increasing intoxication. He was convinced his plan was proceeding perfectly, that his naive military wife was being successfully prepared for murder. But the recording devices hidden in my jewelry were capturing every detail of their conspiracy, and FBI agents positioned throughout the area were documenting their behavior as evidence for the federal prosecution that would follow their arrest. Marcus thought he was executing the perfect crime, but he was actually providing evidence for his own conviction. As dinner progressed toward its conclusion, Marcus suggested we take a romantic walk along the beach to enjoy the moonlight and ocean breeze. "The water looks so inviting tonight," he said, his voice carrying undertones that would have seemed romantic to casual observers, but sounded threatening to someone who knew his real intentions. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, standing up, with the slightly unsteady movement of someone who had consumed more alcohol than was advisable. I love walking on the beach at night. We left the restaurant together, with Kira following at a discreet distance, and began walking toward the secluded cove where Marcus planned to drown me for $2.5 million in insurance money. But what he didn't know was that every step we took was being monitored by federal agents equipped with night vision technology, and the isolated location he'd chosen for my murder was actually surrounded by law enforcement personnel ready to intervene the moment he made his move. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marcus was about to discover that his supposedly helpless victim had been 3 steps ahead of him throughout their entire conspiracy. The moonlight on the Caribbean waters was breathtakingly beautiful as we walked along the secluded stretch of beach that Marcus had selected for my murder. Under different circumstances, this would have been the perfect romantic evening. gentle waves lapping at pristine sand, warm tropical breeze carrying the scent of ocean salt and flowering vegetation, and complete privacy that would have been ideal for intimate conversation between loving spouses. Instead, I was walking toward my planned execution site, while federal agents monitored our every step through night vision surveillance equipment. Marcus's behavior became increasingly focused and predatory as we moved away from the restaurants, lights, and other people. His casual tourist demeanor disappeared, replaced by the calculated movements of someone preparing to commit violence. He kept checking his watch, scanning the beach for potential witnesses, and positioning himself between me and the path back to civilization. "The water looks perfect for swimming tonight," he said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, cold, determined, completely different from the loving husband who had been speaking to me just minutes earlier. Very calm, very inviting. The kind of conditions that make you want to just dive in and let the ocean carry you away. I recognized the shift in his personality with the clarity that military training provides when identifying imminent threats. This wasn't Marcus the charming defense contractor anymore. This was Marcus the killer, and he was transitioning into operational mode for my assassination. "It does look tempting," I replied, maintaining the slightly intoxicated persona that he expected while my hand moved closer to the panic button concealed in my bracelet. "But I'm not sure I'm steady enough for swimming after all that wine at dinner." "Don't worry about that," Marcus said, moving closer and placing his hand on my lower back in what would have appeared to be a supportive gesture to any casual observer. "I'll take care of everything. You just need to trust me completely and do exactly what I tell you to do." Kira had been following us at a distance of about 50 yards, close enough to assist with the murder, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability if anything went wrong with their plan. She was now moving closer, her elegant evening dress replaced by dark clothing that would be less visible to potential witnesses. As we reached the isolated cove that Marcus had identified during his reconnaissance, he stopped walking and turned, to face me with an expression that had transformed completely from loving husband to calculating predator. The mask he'd been wearing for 3 years had finally slipped away, revealing the sociopathic killer underneath. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice now completely devoid of the warmth and affection that had characterized our entire relationship. "Something about our marriage, about my business, about why we're really here. In Mexico." I felt my pulse accelerate as I realized Marcus was about to confess his murder plot, probably as some kind of psychological torture before attempting to kill me. The recording device in my necklace was capturing every word, preserving evidence that would guarantee his conviction for premeditated murder. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping slightly backward toward the water to create the positioning that would allow FBI agents to intervene most effectively when Marcus made his move. "My business never existed," Marcus said with the casual tone of someone discussing mundane facts rather than confessing to elaborate criminal deception. "The Pentagon contracts, the defense projects, the government meetings, all of it was fiction designed to maintain our lifestyle while I figured out how to solve my real financial problems." He was confessing to years of fraud with the confidence of someone who believed his victim would never have the opportunity to repeat his admissions to anyone else. Marcus thought he was safe to reveal the truth because he planned to kill me within the next few minutes. "I don't understand," I said, though of course I understood perfectly. "How have you been paying for our house, our cars, our vacations?" "Credit, fraud, identity theft, money laundering for drug cartels," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "I've been running financial scams since before we met, and marrying you provided the perfect cover for my operations. A decorated military veteran makes an excellent front for criminal activities." Kira had now moved close enough to participate directly in the conversation, abandoning any pretense that her presence was coincidental. She was carrying what appeared to be a small waterproof bag, probably containing supplies they planned to use during my murder or evidence they needed to dispose of afterward. "Hello, Sarah," she said with a smile that contained no warmth or humanity. I think it's time we were properly introduced. I'm not an electronics consultant working on defense contracts. I'm Marcus's lover, business partner, and the person who's been planning every detail of what's about to happen to you. The casual cruelty in her voice was chilling. Kira was discussing my imminent murder with the same tone most people used for routine social introductions, demonstrating a complete absence of empathy or conscience that confirmed my assessment of her as a sociopathic killer. Marcus owes some very dangerous people a substantial amount of money, she continued, clearly enjoying the psychological torture she was inflicting by explaining my situation in detail. Your life insurance policy represents the solution to his debt problems and the funding for our new life together in South America. Marcus nodded, his expression showing satisfaction at finally being able to reveal the truth about our relationship. $2.5 million will pay off the cartel, cover our relocation expenses, and provide enough capital to start fresh in a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. But what about the investigation? I asked, playing the role of confused victim while positioning myself for the FBI intervention I knew was coming. Insurance companies investigate suspicious deaths, especially when large amounts of money are involved. Already handled, Kira replied with professional confidence. Marcus has been building documentation of your deteriorating mental health for months. The VA psychiatric evaluation he scheduled, the reports of PTSD symptoms, the patterns of erratic behavior he's been describing to your friends and family. Everything points toward a combat veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. When your body is found tomorrow morning, Marcus added, everyone will assume you committed suicide while under the influence of alcohol. A tragic case of a war hero who survived Afghanistan but couldn't survive her own trauma. The insurance company will pay out within 60 days and will be living comfortably in Brazil before anyone asks difficult questions. The completeness of their planning was both impressive and terrifying. They had considered every angle, anticipated every potential complication, and prepared responses that would protect them from suspicion while ensuring they received the insurance money quickly. But what they hadn't anticipated was that their supposedly broken veteran victim had been documenting their entire conspiracy with the assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every confession they were making was being recorded as evidence, and every detail of their murder plan was being preserved for federal prosecution. It's nothing personal, Marcus said as he began moving toward me with clear predatory intent. You're actually a good person who deserved better than this. But sometimes innocent people become collateral damage in larger operations. The important thing is that you don't suffer unnecessarily, Kira added with false compassion that made her sound even more sociopathic. We've planned this to be quick and relatively painless. The alcohol will impair your reflexes, and drowning is supposed to be peaceful once you stop fighting. Marcus was now within arm's reach, preparing to grab me and force me into the water, where he would hold me underwater until I died. His muscles were tensed for violence, his eyes focused with the concentration of someone about to commit murder. But as his hands reached toward me, something extraordinary happened. Powerful floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire beach, transforming the romantic moonlit setting into what looked like a military operation zone. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as Coast Guard aircraft converged on our location from multiple directions. FBI, nobody move! Agent Park's voice boomed across the beach through a portable speaker system as dozens of federal agents emerged from concealed positions throughout the area. Marcus and Kira froze in complete shock, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their perfect murder plan had somehow become a perfect trap. They looked around frantically, trying to understand how their isolated killing ground had suddenly become surrounded by heavily armed law enforcement personnel. Sarah Thompson, step away from the suspects and move toward the agents, Agent Park commanded through the speaker system. I walked calmly toward the FBI agents, removing the recording equipment from my jewelry and holding it up so Marcus and Kira could see exactly how their conspiracy had been documented. Every word you said. Tonight was recorded. I told them with the satisfaction of someone who had outmaneuvered professional criminals. Every confession, every detail of your murder plan, every casual discussion of my death, all of it is evidence that will guarantee you spend the rest of your lives in federal prison. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, rage, and finally resigned defeat as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew everything from the beginning. I knew about the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, your fake business, your affair with Kira, and your plan to kill me for insurance money," I replied. "I also knew you were underestimating exactly who you married. You thought you could murder a Marine Corps intelligence specialist without consequences, but you forgot that my training included identifying and eliminating threats to American personnel." Kira was staring at me with something that might have been respect, if it hadn't been combined with murderous hatred. "When did you figure it out?" she asked as FBI agents moved to handcuff both suspects. "When Marcus scheduled that fake VA psychiatric evaluation without my knowledge," I said. "That's when I realized you weren't just planning to steal my money. You were planning to kill me and frame it as suicide related to combat trauma." Agent Park approached with additional agents, all wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons that emphasized the seriousness of the federal crimes Marcus and Kira had been planning to commit. "Marcus Thompson and Kira Valencquez, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, money laundering, and approximately 15 other federal crimes that will keep you in prison for the rest of your natural lives," Agent Park announced with professional satisfaction. As the agents led Marcus and Kira away in handcuffs, Marcus turned back toward me one final time. "I really did love you," he said with what seemed like genuine emotion. "At least, I loved you as much as someone like me is capable of loving anyone." I looked at him steadily. This man who had shared my bed while planning my death, who had promised to love and protect me while coordinating my assassination. "You loved me the way a hunter loves prey," I replied. "The same way you loved our house, our cars, and everything else you planned to steal from me. But you made one fatal mistake, Marcus. You underestimated your target." 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Marcus receive 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kira received the same sentence, plus additional time for her involvement in the previous murders that FBI investigation had connected to her activities. The judge's words were uncompromising as she described their crimes. The defendants calculated, "Manipulation and planned murder of innocent people represents a level of depravity that demands the fullest possible punishment under federal law," she said. "The evidence presented in this case demonstrates systematic criminal behavior that shows complete disregard for human life and the rule of law." But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the letters I received from law enforcement, agencies in multiple states, thanking me for providing evidence that had solved cold cases involving Kira's previous victims. The operation that saved my life had also brought justice to families who had spent years believing their loved ones died in tragic accidents rather than calculated murders. Standing outside the courthouse that day, I felt the warm North Carolina sunshine on my face and realized I was exactly where I needed to be. Not the naive wife who had trusted blindly, but not the bitter victim of a criminal conspiracy either. I was someone who had faced the worst that human nature could offer and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than I'd ever imagined possible. The predator who thought he had identified the perfect victim had instead encountered a Marine Corps veteran trained to eliminate threats to American citizens. And in the end, justice had been served with the same precision and effectiveness that characterized every successful military operation I'd ever been part of. Marcus was right about one thing. It had been a night we would never forget. Just not for the reasons he had originally planned. The aftermath of Marcus and Kira's arrest created a media sensation that I hadn't anticipated. Marine veteran exposes husband's murder plot became front-page news across North Carolina for weeks. with reporters camping outside our farmhouse and requesting interviews about how I'd uncovered and dismantled the conspiracy. The attention was overwhelming, but I understood the public fascination with a story that combined military heroism, domestic betrayal, and sophisticated criminal investigation. I gave one carefully controlled interview to a respected local television journalist, mainly to ensure the story was told accurately and to honor the other victims whose families deserved to know the truth about their loved ones' deaths. After that, I refused all media requests and focused on rebuilding my life from the wreckage Marcus had created. The financial situation was complex, but ultimately favorable. Marcus's assets were seized as proceeds of criminal activity, but as the victim of his fraud, I was entitled to recover everything that had been stolen from our joint accounts. The offshore transfers were reversed through international law enforcement cooperation, and the life insurance companies settled quickly rather than face public scrutiny about how easily their systems had been manipulated. More importantly, the FBI's investigation had uncovered additional insurance fraud schemes that Marcus and Kira had been planning, potentially saving other women from becoming victims of their murder operation. Agent Park estimated that our collaboration had prevented at least 3 additional murders that were in various stages of planning. Your courage in maintaining operational cover for 3 weeks while living with someone planning to kill you saved more lives than just your own, she told me during our final debriefing session. The evidence we gathered through your cooperation will be used to prosecute similar cases for years to come. The legal proceedings stretched over 8 months, during which I had to testify in multiple trials and provide depositions for civil cases involving Marcus's previous victims. Each court appearance was emotionally challenging, requiring me to relive the betrayal and terror of discovering my husband's murder plot while maintaining the professional composure necessary for effective testimony. But the most difficult aspect of the post-arrest period was processing the psychological impact of learning that my entire marriage had been built on deception. Every memory I'd cherished, our first meeting, our wedding, the romantic vacations, the intimate conversations about our future together, all of it had been calculated manipulation designed to position me as a victim for eventual murder. The Veterans Administration provided specialized counseling for military personnel who had experienced domestic violence and criminal victimization. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans with complex trauma, helped me understand that my ability to survive Marcus's conspiracy was directly connected to the skills I'd developed during military service. Your combat training prepared you to recognize threats, gather intelligence, and respond strategically under extreme pressure, she explained during one of our sessions. Most civilian victims of domestic violence don't have those capabilities, which is why they often become trapped in abusive relationships. Your military experience literally saved your life. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had tried to use my military service against me, claiming my combat trauma made me mentally unstable and suicidal, when in reality my training was what allowed me to identify and defeat his murder conspiracy. He'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of military resilience and the capabilities that combat experience develops in those who survive it. Rebuilding my identity after the trial required confronting some uncomfortable truths about my own judgment and decision-making. How had I lived with Marcus for 3 years without recognizing the signs of his criminal activities? Why had I ignored the warnings from friends and family who noticed inconsistencies in his stories? What did my failure to detect his deception say about my ability to assess character and trustworthiness? Dr. Chen helped me understand that sophisticated con artists like Marcus and Kira specialize in exploiting the trust and loyalty that military personnel develop through shared service experiences. They targeted you specifically because your military background made you an ideal victim, she explained. Veterans are trained to trust their unit members completely, to never leave fellow soldiers behind, and to maintain loyalty even under extreme stress. Those admirable qualities become vulnerabilities when criminals manipulate them for personal gain. The farmhouse in Fayetteville held too many memories of my life with Marcus to feel comfortable anymore. Every room contained reminders of the elaborate fiction he'd constructed around our relationship, and I found myself unable to relax in spaces where he'd planned my murder while pretending to love me. I decided to sell the property and start fresh somewhere that wasn't contaminated by his presence. I used the financial settlement from Marcus's criminal activities to purchase a smaller ranch-style home in Asheville, North Carolina, near the mountains where I'd always felt most peaceful. The new house was modest but comfortable, with a workshop, space where I could continue restoring classic cars, and enough property for Ranger to run freely without the painful associations of our previous home. The transition to single life after the trial was both liberating and challenging. For the first time in years, I could make decisions based entirely on my own preferences and values, without considering how they might affect a relationship that had been built on lies anyway. But I also had to rebuild my social connections and develop new routines that didn't revolve around accommodating someone else's schedule and preferences. My work as a veterans transition counselor took on new meaning after my experience with Marcus's conspiracy. I found myself particularly effective at helping female veterans recognize and address domestic violence situations, drawing on my own experience to identify warning signs that other counselors might miss. Trust your instincts, I would tell clients who described relationships that seemed too good to be true, or partners who insisted on controlling financial decisions. If something feels wrong, investigate it. Your military training taught you to recognize threats. Don't ignore those skills just because you're dealing with civilian relationships instead of combat situations. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying. Helping other veterans avoid the kind of manipulation I'd experienced felt like a natural extension of the military principle that you never leave fellow soldiers behind. Every client I helped recognize and escape an abusive relationship was a victory against the kind of predators who had targeted me. About a year after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor at my new home in Asheville. Detective Lieutenant Albert Morrison, my father's former partner from the Newark Police Department, had driven down from New Jersey to deliver news that would change my understanding of Marcus's criminal activities even further. "Sarah, we've been investigating some cold cases that might be connected to your husband's operation," Detective Morrison explained as we sat on my porch overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. "The financial records that the FBI seized have helped us trace money movements that we think are linked to unsolved murders in 3 states. The investigation had revealed that Marcus's criminal network was much larger than anyone had initially realized. He hadn't just been working with Kira to target wealthy women for insurance fraud murders. He'd been part of a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in identity theft, financial fraud, and contract killing operations across the southeastern United States. "How many victims are we talking about?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "At least 12 confirmed deaths over the past 5 years, possibly more," Detective Morrison replied. "Your cooperation with the FBI gave us the evidence we needed to connect Marcus to criminal activities that law enforcement agencies have been investigating for years without success. The scope of Marcus's criminal activities was staggering. What I'd thought was a personal betrayal involving insurance fraud and attempted murder was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been destroying lives across multiple states. The man I'd married wasn't just a con artist who had targeted me specifically. He was a professional criminal who specialized in identifying and eliminating vulnerable victims. But Detective Morrison also brought positive news about the impact of my case on law enforcement capabilities. The methods you used to gather evidence and the cooperation you provided during the investigation have been studied by federal agencies and incorporated into training programs for domestic violence cases involving military personnel," he explained. My experience had been documented as a case study for training law enforcement officers, FBI agents, and military personnel about how to recognize and respond to sophisticated domestic violence situations involving criminal conspiracies. The techniques I'd used to maintain operational security while gathering evidence were being taught to other potential victims who might find themselves in similar situations. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Department of Veterans Affairs invited me to speak at their annual conference on veterans issues, addressing an audience of medical professionals, counselors, and policymakers about the intersection of military service and domestic violence. Female veterans face unique challenges when transitioning to civilian relationships, I told the conference audience. Our military training teaches us loyalty, trust, and commitment to our unit members. Those admirable qualities can become vulnerabilities when criminals specifically target veterans for exploitation. The presentation was emotionally difficult, but professionally satisfying. Using my experience to educate others about the warning signs of domestic violence and criminal manipulation felt like a natural extension of my military service. Protecting fellow veterans from threats they might not recognize until it was too late. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I was contacted by documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the story of how I'd exposed and defeated his murder conspiracy. Initially, I was reluctant to participate in anything that would bring renewed media attention to my personal life. But I eventually agreed to cooperate with the project because it would raise awareness about domestic violence targeting military personnel. The documentary, titled The Marine's Last Mission, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was subsequently distributed through streaming services nationwide. The film focused on the investigative techniques I'd used to gather evidence and the law enforcement cooperation that had made Marcus's arrest possible, rather than sensationalizing the personal betrayal aspects of the story. More importantly, the documentary included interviews with other survivors of domestic violence and criminal victimization, demonstrating that my experience wasn't unique and that the skills developed through military training could be applied to civilian threat assessment and personal security. The film's success led to speaking opportunities at law enforcement conferences, military installations, and veterans organizations across the country. I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for domestic violence awareness and prevention, using my experience to help others recognize and respond to similar threats. The most important lesson from my experience, I would tell audiences, is that trust should be earned through consistent actions over time, not granted automatically based on charm, promises, or emotional manipulation. Military personnel are trained to verify intelligence before acting on it. We should apply the same principles to our personal relationships. 3 years after Marcus's arrest, I received news that provided a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Kira Valencquez had died in federal prison, apparently from complications related to a medical condition she'd been hiding during her criminal activities. Her death meant that one of the most dangerous predators I'd ever encountered would never have the opportunity to target another victim. Marcus remained in federal prison, serving his life sentence without possibility of parole. According to correctional officials, he'd become a model prisoner who spent most of his time in the prison library, apparently working on some kind of memoir about his criminal activities. I had no interest in reading his version of events, but I was satisfied that he would spend the rest of his life paying for the crimes he'd committed against me, and so many others. The greatest victory wasn't Marcus's imprisonment or Kira's death. It was the knowledge that my experience had been transformed into something that could protect other people from similar victimization. Every law enforcement officer trained using my case study, every veteran who recognized warning signs because of my presentations, every potential victim who trusted their instincts because of the documentary, all of them represented lives saved and tragedies prevented. I'd learned that survival wasn't just about escaping immediate danger. True survival meant using your experience to make the world safer for others, turning personal trauma into public service, and ensuring that the courage required to face evil could be passed on to those who needed it most. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, I found myself standing in front of a congressional subcommittee on Veterans Affairs. preparing to testify about legislation that would strengthen protection for military personnel against domestic violence and financial exploitation. The hearing room was packed with lawmakers, advocates, and media representatives, all focused on understanding how my experience could inform policy changes that might save other lives. Mrs. Thompson, the subcommittee chairwoman began, "Your case has become a landmark example of how military training can be applied to civilian threat assessment. Can you explain to the committee how your Marine Corps experience prepared you to recognize and respond to your husband's criminal conspiracy?" I looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected genuine interest in protecting veterans from the kind of predators who had targeted me. "Senator, my military intelligence training taught me to recognize patterns, document evidence, and analyze threats systematically. When inconsistencies appeared in my husband's behavior, I applied those same skills to assess whether he represented a danger to my safety and security." The testimony continued for 3 hours, covering everything, from the warning signs I'd initially missed to the investigative techniques that had ultimately saved my life. Committee members asked detailed questions about how federal agencies could better protect military personnel from sophisticated criminal conspiracies and what resources were needed to identify domestic violence situations involving veterans. But the most important moment came when Senator Maria Rodriguez from Texas asked about the broader implications of my case for military families. "Mrs. Thompson, how many other service members do you think might be experiencing similar victimization without recognizing the danger they're facing?" "Senator, based on my work with veterans organizations over the past 5 years, I believe domestic violence and financial exploitation targeting military personnel is far more common than most people realize," I replied. "Criminals specifically target veterans because our training teaches us loyalty, trust, and commitment to our unit members. Those admirable qualities become vulnerabilities when predators manipulate them for personal gain." The legislation that emerged from those hearings, known as the Veterans Protection Act, established new federal resources for identifying and prosecuting crimes targeting military personnel and their families. The law created specialized training programs for law enforcement officers, enhanced penalties for criminals who targeted veterans, and provided funding for victim services specifically designed for military personnel. More importantly, the act mandated that all branches of the military provide education about domestic violence and financial exploitation as part of transition training for personnel leaving active duty. Every service member would receive information about the warning signs of criminal manipulation and resources for seeking help if they found themselves in dangerous situations. The personal satisfaction of contributing to legislative changes that could protect other veterans was immense, but it also marked a transition in how I understood my own experience. What had started as a personal survival story had evolved into a public service mission that connected me with a community of advocates, survivors, and professionals working to address domestic violence in military communities. My relationship with Ranger had also evolved significantly during this period. The German Shepherd who had once positioned himself protectively between Marcus and me had become my constant companion and emotional support animal, accompanying me to speaking engagements and providing comfort during difficult moments when memories of the conspiracy resurfaced unexpectedly. "He knew," Dr. Chen observed during one of our sessions, watching Ranger rest his head on my knee while we talked. "Dogs can sense predatory behavior and aggressive intentions that humans miss. His protective positioning during your marriage wasn't random. He was responding to threats that your conscious mind hadn't yet recognized." The insight made me realize how many warning signs I'd rationalized away during my relationship with Marcus. Ranger's behavior, my father's suspicions, friends' comments about Marcus's stories not quite adding up. All of these had been accurate assessments that I'd dismissed because I wanted to believe in the fairy tale life Marcus had constructed around our marriage. The work I'd begun with veterans transition counseling had expanded into a full-time consulting practice focused on domestic violence prevention and survivor advocacy. I traveled frequently to military installations, law enforcement conferences, and educational institutions, sharing my experience and training others to recognize the sophisticated manipulation techniques that criminals use to target vulnerable populations. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was meeting other survivors who had successfully escaped dangerous situations using skills and resources they'd developed through military service. Their stories reinforced my belief that combat training, properly applied, could be an effective defense against domestic predators. Jessica Martinez, a Navy veteran from San Diego, had used her military police training to gather evidence against an abusive partner who was embezzling money from veteran service organizations. David Kim, an Army intelligence specialist, had exposed a romance scam that was targeting recently divorced veterans through online dating platforms. Maria Santos, a Marine Corps logistics officer, had identified and reported a financial advisor who was specifically targeting military families for investment fraud. Each of these cases demonstrated that the skills military personnel developed during service, attention to detail, systematic analysis, evidence documentation, strategic thinking, could be powerful tools for personal protection when properly applied to civilian relationships and financial decisions. The speaking engagements also connected me with law enforcement, professionals who were implementing new approaches to domestic violence cases involving military personnel. Detective Sarah Williams from the Colorado Springs Police Department had developed protocols specifically designed to help veterans recognize and report domestic violence situations. Military personnel often don't identify what they're experiencing as domestic violence because they're trained to endure hardship and solve problems independently, Detective Williams explained during a conference panel discussion. We've had to modify our outreach and intervention strategies to address the unique cultural factors that affect how veterans respond to victimization. The collaboration between military advocates, law enforcement professionals, and survivor communities was creating new resources and approaches that hadn't existed when I was dealing with Marcus's conspiracy. Victims now had access to specialized counseling services, legal advocacy programs, and financial assistance specifically designed for military personnel and their families. But perhaps the most significant development was the creation of a national database that tracked domestic violence cases involving military personnel, allowing law enforcement agencies to identify patterns and connect cases that might otherwise seem unrelated. The system had already identified several criminal organizations that were specifically targeting veterans for various types of exploitation. Agent Jennifer Park, who had coordinated the FBI investigation of Marcus and Kira, was now directing a federal task force focused on crimes targeting military communities. Your case demonstrated that domestic violence affecting veterans often involves sophisticated criminal networks rather than isolated incidents, she explained during a joint presentation we gave to federal law enforcement personnel. The evidence, gathering techniques that Mrs. Thompson used, combined with federal investigative resources, created a model for addressing these crimes that we're now applying to cases across the country. Agent Park continued, We've been able to prevent numerous planned murders and dismantle criminal organizations that were systematically targeting military families. The federal task force had identified and prosecuted 12 separate criminal networks that were using tactics similar to Marcus and Kira's operation. The cumulative impact included preventing an estimated 37 planned murders, recovering more than $15 million in stolen assets, and connecting previously unsolved cases involving suspicious deaths of military personnel and their families. My personal life had also stabilized and flourished during this period. The house in Asheville had become a comfortable retreat where I could decompress between travel commitments and maintain the privacy necessary for emotional recovery and personal growth. The mountains provided a sense of peace and perspective that helped me process the ongoing impact of my experience with Marcus's conspiracy. Dating had been challenging initially, as learning to trust romantic partners again required overcoming the trauma of discovering that my marriage had been built entirely on deception and criminal manipulation. Dr. Chen had warned me that developing new relationships would be complicated by hypervigilance and the tendency to analyze every interaction for signs of potential deception. But gradually, I'd learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and paranoid suspicion, developing the ability to trust appropriately while maintaining the awareness necessary to protect myself from future victimization. The key was applying the same systematic analysis I'd used in military intelligence work, gathering information over time, verifying claims through independent sources, and trusting my instincts when something didn't feel right. 2 years earlier, I'd met Daniel Rodriguez, a fellow Marine Corps veteran who worked as a counselor for wounded warriors at the VA Medical Center in Asheville. Our relationship had developed slowly and carefully, with both of us understanding the importance of building trust through consistent actions rather than romantic promises or emotional manipulation. Daniel's experience treating combat trauma had given him insight into the psychological challenges that veterans face when transitioning to civilian relationships. He understood my need for independence, respected my work advocating for domestic violence survivors, and supported my speaking commitments without trying to control or limit my professional activities. The difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, Daniel had observed early in our courtship, is that healthy partners encourage each other's growth and independence, while predators try to isolate and control their victims. Everything Marcus did was designed to make you dependent on him and disconnected from support systems that might have helped you recognize his deception. Our relationship had reached the point where we were discussing marriage, but approaching the decision with the careful analysis that both of our experiences had taught us was necessary. We'd undergone couples counseling to address potential issues related to my trauma history, established clear communication protocols for financial decisions, and developed contingency plans for protecting our individual assets and interests. The contrast between my relationship with Daniel and my marriage to Marcus was stark and educational. Daniel encouraged my professional work, supported my advocacy activities, and celebrated my successes without trying to claim credit or control the direction of my career. He shared financial information openly, invited scrutiny of his background and activities, and respected my need for independence and personal space. Most importantly, Daniel had demonstrated his character through consistent actions over time, rather than through dramatic gestures or elaborate promises. He'd been present during difficult moments without trying to solve my problems for me, supportive of my decisions without trying to influence them for his benefit, and honest about his own limitations and past mistakes. The experience with Marcus had taught me that true love involves respecting someone's autonomy and supporting their individual growth, rather than trying to control or manipulate them for personal gain. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, open communication, and shared commitment to each other's welfare and happiness. As I prepared for another speaking engagement at a military installation in Virginia, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that terrifying night in Mexico, when Marcus had tried to murder me for insurance money. The naive military wife who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone who understood the importance of vigilance, evidence-based decision-making, and strategic thinking in all aspects of life. But I'd also learned that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger. It was about transforming trauma into purpose, using personal experience to serve others, and building new relationships based on wisdom gained through adversity. The skills that had saved my life during Marcus's conspiracy had become tools for helping other people recognize and escape similar threats. The Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, had taken on new meaning through my experience. Faithfulness wasn't just about loyalty to fellow Marines during military service. It was about remaining committed to protecting innocent people from predators who would exploit their trust and vulnerability for personal gain. Every veteran I helped recognize domestic violence, every law enforcement officer trained using my case study, every policy change implemented because of my testimony represented a victory against the kind of evil that Marcus and Kira had embodied. The conspiracy that was supposed to destroy my life had instead become the foundation for protecting countless others from similar victimization. Standing before another audience of military personnel, preparing to share my story one more time, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning personal tragedy into public service, individual survival into collective protection, and private trauma into societal change. The mission continues, and the fight to protect America's veterans from those who would exploit their service and sacrifice remains as important as any battle fought on foreign soil. The most unexpected call came on a quiet Tuesday morning in November, exactly 6 years. After that night in Mexico when Marcus tried to kill me, it was Agent Park, now promoted to Deputy Director of the FBI's Domestic Violence Task Force. "Sarah, we need your help with something unprecedented," she said, her voice carrying the urgency. I remembered from our original investigation. We've identified a network of international criminals who are specifically targeting American veterans worldwide. They're using social media and dating apps to identify military personnel, then replicating Marcus and Kira's playbook on a massive scale. The operation they'd uncovered involved criminals in 12 countries who were coordinating to target American veterans with sophisticated romance scams, identity theft, and murder for insurance plots. They'd been studying my case, learning from Marcus's mistakes, and developing even more sophisticated methods for victimizing military personnel. "They're calling it Operation Valor," Agent Park continued, "and we need someone with your experience to help us understand their methodology and develop countermeasures." I looked out at the Blue Ridge Mountains, thinking about all the veterans who might be facing the same danger I'd encountered with Marcus. The mission wasn't over. It was evolving into something larger and more important than I'd ever imagined. "When do we start?" I asked, already knowing that my next chapter would involve protecting fellow veterans on an international scale. As I ended the call, Ranger lifted his head and looked at me with the same protective alertness he'd shown during those dangerous months with Marcus. Some battles end, but the war to protect those who've served our country never stops. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, I'll be sharing the incredible story of how we infiltrated Operation Valor and saved hundreds of veterans worldwide. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful true stories of survival, justice, and hope. Thank you for watching, and remember, always trust your instincts.